That's not to say that somebody else would have done a terrible job. I mean, by no means, there's probably people that would have done a way better job than what I did over that summer. But for each of us, we were put there for a specific reason, for such a time as this. And we, as believers, are placed where we are for such a time as this. And that's what we're going to be looking at this morning. So if you would all turn, we're going to look at in the book of Esther, Esther chapter 4. So Esther in chapter 4, we're going to first take a look at verses 13 through 14. But we'll go all the way through 17 this morning. Esther chapter 4. Man, what did I say? Okay, Esther chapter 4. The first verses 13 and 14 we'll look at here, and this is what it says. It says, Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise to the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Okay. See, folks, here Esther is in a pickle. All right, the plot by Haman to destroy the Jews, to eliminate them, has come to the knowledge of Mordecai and now to Esther, and she's in this pickle of whether she should go to the king or not. All right, and we'll get into that later. But Mordecai gives her the suggestion that maybe, just maybe, she has been put into her current position in this time of desperation for the Jews for such a time as this. All right, and that's what I want to present us all with this morning, that we are in our current positions for such a time as this, in the here and now. And like Esther, we need to recognize that and put our time to good use. Okay. So before we get too far, I do want to back up a little bit. We'll bring up the backstory of Esther up to where our passage is this morning. Just as a quick refresher. Right? So Esther was a young Jewish girl, right? And in the Persian Empire, she's being raised by her cousin Mordecai, and so all this is going on, and the king has Queen Vashti, and he wants to basically parade her around to the other princes and nobles of the area, and she says no. So Vashti is essentially kicked out of her position, and the king goes looking for a new queen. And so the king comes along, he brings all these different young girls to be able to try to see which one will be the next queen, and eventually he lands on Esther. And so Esther's made queen, and then we have a plot against the king from a couple of guardsmen. Mordecai finds out about it. He goes to the king, lets him know, hey, this is going on. So Mordecai is then honored eventually for this, for saving the king from his plot, much to Haman's chagrin, because at this point, Haman, he's trying to get Mordecai to kneel and bow down to him and stuff, trying to really puff himself up. And he doesn't like that Mordecai is not honoring him the way he thinks he should. And so Haman comes up to this plot to kill the Jews. Mordecai finds out, and now and it pretty much brings us to where we are now, that Mordecai then brings us to Esther. He's like, hey, this is going on. What are you going to do about it? Right? So that brings us, again, just to where we are. And so with our passage here, You see, Esther is at a crossroads right now. Right? She has two different options that she could take, right, to make a decision on. The first, and that's what we're going to look at, is this Esther's predicament. Right? Esther's predicament. And we see in verses 13 and 14, we'll just read that real quickly again. It says, Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So Esther has two options that she's going over. She could either fly under the radar and stay silent, which is kind of what we see, what she's kind of thinking right now. That she's in the palace, and she has not disclosed to the king, she hasn't disclosed to anybody that she's a Jew at this point in time. So she's like, maybe I could, just stay silent, I could fly under the radar, I could avoid all this trouble that is coming upon the Jewish people. The other option is that she could just go to the king, but also risk getting killed. And so these are the two options on the table that she has. And so we'll take a look at both of them, and we'll just break them down real quick. All right, so stay silent and hope to fly under the radar. Okay, reading through this passage, and more specifically in my younger years, I'd read it and be like, well, there's the Jews. The Jews are God's chosen people. I mean, of course I'd go say, very self-righteous, right, very puffing myself up, of course I would say, what is Esther thinking? But reading it now, and in my slightly more mature years, slightly, I can see why the decision was so hard. Right? Consider this. Right? Esther goes to the king. The king does not hold out his golden scepter to her. Well, then what? She dies. Right? Because that was the law of the land. So if you went before the king, and the king had this golden scepter, and so he pointed to the person who's coming, and if he pointed it to you, well, you'd be safe and you can present whatever it is to the king. If not, however, you're done for. Okay? That was the law of the land. That is what the culture was back then. And so, if the king didn't hold out his golden scepter to her, well, she would die for what would apparently be nothing, because then she wouldn't get a chance to go to the king, tell the king about this plot, or any of that. So, she's possibly thinking here, she's got a better chance flying under the radar because she's in the palace, she didn't tell anybody that she's a Jew, right? So maybe she can, her chances are better to just stay silent, not worry about it, and just continue on with her life. Alright? I'm only 24, and I get why the decision is hard. Okay, I've never really been in a life or death situation, but, growing up, I've done some naughty things. I wasn't a very good child for my parents sometimes. And so, I'd try to fly under the radar. I would try to make it so that they don't, figure out what I did. Never worked out too good for me. However, I would try to do that. But Mordecai comes alongside her and tells her that to not think that she'll be safe from the fate of the Jews. Just because she's in the palace, just because she didn't tell anybody that she's a Jew, it doesn't mean that she's going to be safe. Someone's going to find out eventually or something, and she would perish. Right? It says that if she doesn't do something, and if she remains silent, that the relief and the deliverance that God will bring on the Jewish people will come from somewhere else. Come from someone else. And that there will be consequences for her staying silent. Alright, so there's option one. You can try to take your chances flying under the radar and staying silent. And option two is to go to the king, trust in God, but also risk getting killed. And so this option here, this option 2, came from a human perspective, looking at it, carried a much higher risk. Right? Because you go to the king, he doesn't hold out a scepter, and you're done for. Right? If she did not find favor, she was going to get killed. And for her, that's not a very favorable outcome. If she doesn't, right? Personally, I would agree. I mean, I don't really want to die. I mean, I'm not scared to. I know where I would go. But that doesn't mean that I want to be killed. You know? Right. So this other option required a special component. Trust in the Lord. Trust in God. And this option may have held, per se, a higher risk of being killed by the king, but if the option was to work at all, the way that it would, God needed to be at the center of it. Mordecai recognized this. He recognized it. He wanted Esther to recognize it as well. So he challenged her with this this food for thought kind of statement. He's like, who knows? Perhaps you come to this position of royalty for such a time as this. Like, hey, maybe, just maybe, God put you here in this time of desperation for the Jewish people for this reason. So Esther and Mordecai, they go kind of back and forth through this as they debate with each other, they discuss with each other the pros and the cons of each decision, of each option that she has here. And so she finally comes to the point where she gives Mordecai her final response. Right? And that's what we're going to look at here, is Esther's response. Right? So after learning of the edict that the Jews at a specific time and date are going to be eradicated, Mordecai and Esther, they go back and forth, they discuss the options, dangers, and the repercussions of each one, and finally, Esther sends her response to Mordecai. Right, so we'll look at that. We're looking at verses 15 through 17 of chapter 4. So verses 15 through 17. So then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. If I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered. Alright, so you'll notice here, Esther doesn't tell him option 1 or option 2. She doesn't tell him, like, good luck guys, y'all are on your own. Like, I'm going to just fly under the radar on this one. She doesn't tell him, like, okay, I'll go talk to the king. No, what does she say? She tells him to assemble all the Jews in Susa and fast for 3 days. Don't eat, don't drink. And then she and her servants will do the same thing. Right? And then she'll go to the king regardless of the potential consequences. Right? So see, after all of this debate and this doubt and this fear that she was having of what the repercussions could possibly be with going before the king, she got the idea, she finally understood that God needed to be at the center of it. Right? If it was going to work at all. She finally understood, and she finally got that she needed to trust in God. Right? And that He'll come through for His people. Right? That He won't abandon her and essentially leave her to the wolves. Right? So in the time leading up to what she's going to do before she goes before the king, she didn't just sit around and eat grapes. Right? She didn't pace the floor and worry. Right? She told Mordecai to gather the Jews and to fast for 3 days and 2 nights. but she was active herself. Okay? She said, I and my servants likewise will do the same. We'll fast in the same way. So in her response to Mordecai, she says she's going to fast. Right? And this idea of fasting, it's not what we have as fasting today. This is biblical fasting. Right? And so it's not just, it's not sitting there, being hungry, being a couch potato. It's spending time with God, praying to God, and humbling yourself before God. Okay? So that's what this biblical fasting is. This is what she would have been doing. Okay? Not sitting around, but praying, using her time wisely, asking God for guidance, asking God for direction on what she is to do. Okay? But along with this, we can see another trait, right, in Esther's response, and that would be contentment. Esther was content. All right, this trait, it's a bit more concealed, per se. All right, it's not like a boom, blatant, out there characteristic that we can see. However, we do see it portrayed in verse 16. Right? So if you look with me here in verse 16, it says, this is Esther talking to Mordecai. It says, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. If I perish, I perish. Okay? So she goes from this worry and this doubt and this fear of what could possibly happen when going before the king. And so she goes from this to being content with where God has her. The last part of verse 16 shows this final progression where she says, thus I will go to the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. See, she accepted the fact that there was a possibility of death. Like, if she went before the king. There was that possibility. But, despite that it would be better to trust God, trust in God to where he has her, than to go her own route. Than to miss what he had for her, and to give in to the fear. It would be better to trust in God than to give in to all of that. She was content with the fact that she was in her position for that time. Okay? And that is what we get out of this, folks. Okay? This is where we need to be like Esther. Right? When we're in a similar situation with like Esther, when we have two options, we could go either way. We could either choose to trust God, or we could choose the safer option. What do? What have we done in past decisions? Right? And that brings us to our last aspect of this morning, which is simply our response. We like to think that we would choose the godly response every single time, right? Like, in an effort to make us look more godly, more Christianly, like, oh, I would definitely have chosen to save the Israelites right away. Or, oh, I would definitely do this or that. But how often do we really choose the God option? Right? I'm not necessarily saying that, the God option is always harder, but when given two options, which one do we choose? Even with seemingly small or insignificant situations and decisions that we make, right? We can always choose a God option, one that would be more honoring and glorifying to Him, no matter how small and insignificant or large and significant that we decide they are. And our response should be similar to Esther's in that we need to stay active and also content. Not couch potatoes, not people pacing the floor and worry, but active and content. So how can we be active? What does that entail? Right? Some of these things on being active we know and we actively do. Right? Such as praying to the Lord, reading our Bibles, right? Being in God's Word. Right? Both of which are essential to maintaining a good relationship with the Lord and a growing relationship with the Lord. But other things we may not do as much. Like maybe spreading the gospel, preaching the gospel, like Christ commands us in Matthew 28. Or even something like biblical fasting. Right? Which, I don't know about you guys. I don't do fasting very well. I don't like doing fasting. But it is essential for our personal relationship with God. It is humbling ourselves before God, like Esther did, where she humbled herself before God, revealing our true spiritual condition and having our faith refreshed. Right? That is what this biblical fasting is. But if we aren't careful, if we give into these easier decisions, we ourselves can become spiritually lazy. Because then we can let our guard down. And that's when we trust ourselves more. That's when we make the decisions. Like, times are good, or, oh, I don't have time to pray and ask God for direction in this. So we trust ourselves. Right? That's when and at that point, we're more likely to make that easy decision, that easy solution, the easy way out. Right? Instead of doing it God's way. But also, a part of spiritual laziness, and as part when we're not active in God's Word, then we also have a lack of contentment of where we are. Okay, so we need to be content. There's a lot of times when we aren't content, right? In our own lives. For me, it's something as simple as driving. I cannot stand it. I despise it with every fiber of my being to be stuck behind somebody who refuses to go at least the speed limit. It's 55. Please just go to 55. Right? See, I can't stand it. And then during our time in Michigan, so this is after my internship with our church ended over in Michigan, though, we thought that we were going to get into church fairly quickly. And we knew that God was calling us to pastoral ministry of some sort. We wanted to go, I wanted to go, be a pastor, an assistant pastor, anything. But for whatever the reason was, God kept us there for a little over a year. We spent a lot of time sending out applications and all this stuff. But I was discontent a lot of times. I didn't like sitting in Michigan, feeling like I was spinning my wheels because I wanted to go out. It wasn't wrong for me to want to go out by any means, but God had us in Michigan for a specific reason, and I think that a lot of my time there was wasted because I spent more time thinking about the future and wanting to go, wanting to do this or that, instead of being content with where God had me. So I feel like I wasted a lot of time over there. And I mean, I'm sure God used us in some way, shape, or form while we were still over there. But that doesn't change the fact that I had a spirit of discontentment for a majority of our time there in Michigan. I did not use the time wisely. Right? I did not have an attitude like Esther. Right? But I needed to. We need to in the here and now. We need to have an attitude like Esther. Right? And have that spirit of contentment. Because God has put us all here and now in our specific positions and situations for such a time as this. For such a time as this. Right? We need to have the spirit of contentment like Esther so that we're not focused on the parts that aren't going our way. So that instead we're not losing out on what God has for us, but that we're focused instead on what God can and will use us for, whatever that may look like. To trust God and be content with where He has us, than to go our own way, to give into the fear before we are placed in such a time as this. And as we've gone over our passage this morning, and we've looked at the life of Esther, we've looked at the situation she was put in and her response to it, and how she was put in her specific position for such a time as that, and how we in like manner should respond as we have been put here for such a time as this. And we looked at Esther's predicament. She had two options: to fly under the radar or to trust in God. And her response to her predicament, where she was both active and content, where she spent her time wisely fasting, asking God for guidance, and what her message to Mordecai entailed, and how then we in like manner should respond to our own predicaments and our own positions in life with both activity and contentment. So as we leave here this morning, I want to challenge each and every one of us here, including myself, to pursue being active and content in the Lord with where He has us, wherever He may have us. For we are here for such a time as this. Let's pray. Father in heaven, Lord, I thank You for this day. Lord, once again, I just thank You for this time that we have to be able to gather here freely in Your name, to learn more about You, to grow in our relationship with You, to see what Your Word has to tell us. God, I pray that as we go about, not just our week, Lord, but that as we go about our lives, that we would pursue being active and content, that we would have the attitude like Esther did, Lord, that we would trust You. God, You are with us wherever we go, in whatever positions, whatever situations, whatever predicaments that we may be in. You are always there with us. God, I just pray that as we go, that we would trust You, Lord, and that we would be active and content in our personal relationship with You. God, I just pray all of this in Your holy name. Amen.